The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, President of the Arab Republic of Egypt. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, President of the Arab Republic of Egypt, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
In the name of God, the Compassionate, the Merciful, Mr. President, let me congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the 73rd session of the United Nations General Assembly and express my appreciation for the efforts of Mr. Miroslav Lajčák, the president of the former session. I also commend you in your choice of the theme of this year's session, for we're in dire need for renewing our commitments and contributions as member states, enhancing the United Nations' role as a foundation for a just and effective international order, a world order that is based on the balance of interests and responsibilities, respect for state sovereignty, and the dissemination of a culture of peace, as well as one that rises above racism, extremism, and violence and achieves sustainable development. These are the values that shape Egypt's vision towards the United Nations since our participation in the founding of the organization 7 decades ago, and throughout the 6 terms during which Egypt served on the UN Security Council, the latest of which was in 2016-2017. These values are also the driving force behind Egypt's active contribution to UN peacekeeping operations, making Egypt the world's 7th largest troop-contributing country. With such an unshakable faith in the values and role of the United Nations, we can be fully candid in recognizing that there is a flaw in the international system which negatively affects its performance and casts a shadow over its credibility in the eyes of many peoples, particularly in the Arab and African regions. Egypt is at the heart of both. How can we blame an Arab who questions the credibility of the United Nations and the values it proclaims at a time when his region is threatened by disintegration and the collapse of the nation-state? Facing a wave of terrorism and sectarian conflicts that deplete the capacities of the Arab peoples? Or how can we blame an Arab who wonders why the Palestinian people were denied the legitimate rights to live in dignity and peace in an independent state that reflects their national identity, hopes, and aspirations? Would it be an overstatement if an African complains of the ineffectiveness of world order when his continent suffers from an economic order that perpetuates poverty and inequality, reproduces social and political crises, and provides no prospects for progress or development? Mr. President, I raise these questions as Egypt chairs the Group of 77 in China, a group that constitutes the majority of the population of this planet, and thus has the greatest interest in enhancing the role of the United Nations. Developing countries can ill afford to exist in an international order which is not governed by laws and lofty principles upon which the United Nations was founded, or one that can be subject to polarization or attempts by some to dominate it and impose their will on the members of the international community. Let me sum up Egypt's vision in 3 key principles to which we ought to renew our commitment, and 3 causes to which we must accord priority for the United Nations to regain its effectiveness and role. The first such principle is that there can be no way forward towards achieving an effective international order if its main constituent unit, the nation-state, which is premised on the notions of citizenship, democracy, and equality, is in danger of disintegration. I speak out of Egypt's unique experience, where the Egyptian people have made tremendous effort to restore their state and save their identity. They chose the nation-state as their vehicle for reform, their just vehicle for reform to achieve their aspirations for freedom, development, and dignity. The disintegration of nations as a result of civil strife or regression to sectarian loyalties is, instead of national identity, is responsible for the most dangerous phenomena in our contemporary world, including armed conflicts, human trafficking, illegal migration, organized crime, and illicit trade in arms and drug trafficking. There is no doubt that the Arab region is one of the most vulnerable in the world to the dangers of nation-state disintegration and the ensuing creation of a fertile environment for terrorism and exacerbation of sectarian conflict. Thus, preserving and reforming the foundation of the state is a fundamental priority of Egypt's foreign policy in the Arab region. There can be no way out of the crisis in Syria or the plight of Yemen except by restoring the nation-state, preserving its sovereignty, and achieving and state institutions, as well as achieving the legitimate aspirations of its people. Egypt fully supports a UN-led political solution in these two countries and rejects any exploitation of these crises to create foothold for regional intervention or enable an environment for terrorism, extremism, and sectarianism. The same principle applies to our policy in Libya, where Egypt plays a pivotal role in support of rebuilding the state, particularly with regard to the unification of the Libyan armed forces so that they are capable of defending Libya and countering the dangers of terrorism. We must not forget that a year has already elapsed since the adoption of the United Nations Action Plan on Libya, which sought to comprehensively address the Libyan crisis, and no progress in its implementation was made. This requires a renewal of our commitment to a comprehensive political solution as set forth in the said United Nations Action Plan. If we are to halt the loss of life, the depletion of Libya's resources, and move towards the reconstruction phase, then there is no room for partial solutions in Libya, Syria, or Yemen. Crises of such magnitude require comprehensive and not partial solutions. And moving to the state of reconstruction. Mr. President, the second principle is the commitment to peaceful and sustainable solutions to international conflicts. This is the raison d'etre of the United Nations. Yet, despite the commendable efforts of the UN in numerous conflicts, including South Sudan, the Central African Republic, and Mali, they have so far fallen short of finding permanent settlements to such conflicts. There is also an urgent need to mobilize resources to help countries in post-conflict situations to rehabilitate their institutions and commence reconstruction and development. The fundamental issue here is to translate this principle into tangible support for national efforts so as to overcome conflicts and build states in accordance with their priorities, while avoiding the imposition of alien models of governance and development or interfering in the internal affairs of states and violating their sovereignty. We cannot talk about the peaceful settlement of disputes as a founding principle of the United Nations and an indicator of its credibility without addressing the Palestinian cause. It stands as a perfect example of the failure of the international system to find this just solution to the conflict, based on international legitimacy and United Nations resolutions that guarantee the establishment of a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. The terms of reference of this just solution and the parameters of a final settlement are well known. There is no time to waste on such a debate. What is required is political will to resume negotiations and achieve a settlement in accordance with these parameters. Let me repeat what I have said in previous years. On this platform, the Arabs are still extending a hand in peace. Our peoples deserve to turn this tragic page in history, and the Palestinian people deserve to exercise their legitimate rights. The third principle, Mr. President, is the commitment to achieving sustainable development as a necessary precondition for a stable world order and the best way for the prevention of armed conflict and humanitarian crises. While we welcome the consensus reached on the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, we, however, note that the implementation of the goals set forth in this ambitious plan require that we address the financing for the development conundrum. This can be achieved through the creation of an enabling environment which allows for the free flow of resources necessary for development without imposing any conditionalities and supporting national efforts to mobilize financing for development. The reform of the global economic and financial architecture cannot be delayed. We look forward to the United Nations to serve as a platform for developing ideas to achieve this reform. In particular, with regard to the creation of mechanisms that would help halt illicit financial flows out of developing countries and facilitate the return of these vital assets to their rightful owners. Mr. President, the international commitment to the preservation of the nation state, the peaceful settlement of disputes, strengthening cooperation to achieve comprehensive development and addressing imbalances in the global economic system are all necessary conditions for any serious consideration of the revitalization of the United Nations system and the restoration of its credibility. In order to implement these three aforementioned principles, three main priority areas also need to be addressed in order to ensure the credibility and the future of the United Nations and the international order as a whole. These are, first, we need to strengthen partnerships between the United Nations and regional organizations. And here I would like to refer to the very successful experiment of a cooperation between the African Union and the United Nations as a model to be followed, and to use the comparative advantage of both parties to deal with the serious challenges in our region, which is the main aim of the United Nations to preserve peace and aid for development. Egypt is about to assume the presidency of the African Union in 2029, and we look forward to strengthening the strategic partnership between the Union and the United Nations through programs that have a real impact on the continent, and building on the progress made to consolidate the policy of the African Union, post-conflict reconstruction and development policy. This is in addition to Egypt's hosting of the African Union Center for Post-Conflict Reconstruction and Development and the Community of Sahel-Saharan States Counterterrorism Center. Second, we need to continue our efforts to implement the initiative launched by Egypt during its membership of the UN Security Council to put in place a comprehensive international framework to develop policies and bolster cooperation in order to counter terrorism and terrorist narratives. In this context, we welcome the Secretary General's initiative to convene the UN Conference on Counter-Terrorism last June, following the periodic review of the United Nations counter-terrorism strategy. As you're well aware, Egypt is engaged since the beginning of this year in the comprehensive cooperation Operation Sinai 2018 to combat and decisively eradicate terrorism. This is taking place through a comprehensive strategy that integrates security, ideological, and development dimensions. Based on this experience, on Egypt's overall experience in supporting counter-terrorism efforts in the Middle East and North Africa, I can assure you that the level of finance, the sophistication of arms and training, as well as the means of communication obtained by these extremist groups, and the facilitation of movement and travel of foreign terrorist fighters, point to the inevitable need to develop a global system to combat terrorism wherever it exists, and to cut off its sources of support in every possible way. Third, we need to address the major shortcomings in the international community's handling of human rights issues. The credibility of the United Nations cannot be restored as long as millions continue to suffer extreme poverty, live under foreign occupation, or fall victim to terrorism and armed conflict. The protection of human rights will not be achieved through media defamation or the politicization of human rights mechanisms, while ignoring the need to tackle all human rights in an equitable manner, including economic, social, and cultural rights on equal footing. Egypt has a solid constitutional foundation for the protection of human rights. In its most noble manifestation, major strides have been achieved in the field of women and youth empowerment. Women hold 25% of ministerial posts and more than 15% of seats in parliament. We rely on youth in all leading positions in the country, and international youth conferences, which are held annually in Egypt in November, have also become a regular forum for the youth to communicate and raise concerns. We're determined to continue to accord high priority to the issues of women, economic empowerment, youth, science, technology, and innovation during Egypt's presidency of the Group of 77 in China, as a practical example of our commitment to the promotion of human rights in a comprehensive manner. Mr. President, Egypt, like the vast majority of the world's peoples and nations, has a vested interest in restoring the credibility of the multilateral system with the United Nations at its forefront. We believe that the organization can overcome skepticism over its merit and credibility by restoring the lofty principles upon which its charter was premised and acting according to the priorities I addressed and that reflect the aspirations of our peoples. Only then will our organization reclaim its credibility and our peoples regain their confidence in a future of peace, cooperation, and respect of the other. Thank you for your attention. May the Lord help us and you for the good of all of our peoples. Long live Egypt, long live Egypt, long live Egypt.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Arab Republic of Egypt for the statement just made. May I request representatives to remain seated while we greet the head of state.